Hello guys, it's Amanda and welcome back to my channel. I'm in a pretty good mood today. I'm gonna be doing this sit down chatty video, maybe make it into a video essay, I don't know. But today I'm going to try to answer a question that's been on my mind for a while. Why can't black women be the love interest? Short answer, racism and white supremacy. Long answer, that's what this video is for. So this all started when I decided to watch Modern Love, and if you don't know what that is, it's a show on Amazon Prime, which was adapted from the New York Times column, Modern Love, which is a column about love, relationships, betrayal, revelations, all that kind of stuff. I listened to a few episodes of the Modern Love podcast before this, and I found it to be a cute and heartwarming listen, so when I found out that there was a TV show, of course, I had to watch it. So I watched 2 episodes and I thought it was wholesome. I may have shed a tear, and then I was like, you know what, this is an anthology series. I don't have to watch it in order, so let me just skip to an episode where a black woman is the love interest, because I would love to see that. Imagine my surprise when I looked at the thumbnails of all the rest of the episodes and there were only white actresses. Honestly, my first thought was, this can't be right. This is a show set in New York City in modern times based off of real stories, and somehow every single female love interest in every single episode is a white woman? So naturally, I went to Google to see if anyone was thinking the same thing as me. Why are there no women of color in Modern Love? And I came across an amazing Medium article called Is Modern Love Only for White Women, written by Nyla Burton, and it basically affirmed everything I was thinking about the show and how I felt about the larger romance industrial complex as a black woman. Emphasize on the woman part, because in Modern Love there are quite a few men of color. There's 2 black men, 1 Indian man, and 1 Japanese man that are all shown either in love, falling in love, or trying to fall in love with white people. And honestly, I feel like this show and so many other pieces of media that exclude women of color, specifically black women, from being portrayed as a desirable love interest are sending a message via omission, and the message is, you are not wanted. And on top of that, there are all these statistics that show black women are marrying less frequently, less stably, and divorcing more commonly than their peers. All of this information can kind of fuck up what you think about yourself and your desirability and what you should expect from a relationship. And I feel like this is something that has definitely festered in my mind for a while, especially going to predominantly white schools. But seeing the lack of black women in the TV show Modern Love is what really has raised this question to the surface for me. Also, apparently my TikTok For You page knows everything that I'm thinking.
If you were a black girl that went to a predominantly white public school between the years of 2012 and 2018, you qualify for veterans discount.
There's even a study in sociology of education that showed that boys of color in predominantly white schools have an easier time assimilating because they are able to access coolness in a way that girls of color are not. Black women should not have to lower their expectations or their value based on something that we cannot control. So my question is, how did we get here? Racism, but also, how do we change this? For how did we get here, I found a very comprehensive answer in Nicole Seck's paper, The Hypersexualization and Undesirability of Black/African Women. Seck writes, institutionalized rape of Black/African women acted as the impetus for the development of controlling images alike the Jezebel and the animalistic, sexually deviant other. Such dominant imageries were required in order to support enslavement policies, namely those which stated that Black/African women were expected to produce numerous children who would later on in life become benefactors of the economy of slavery. So yeah, basically slave owners invented this Jezebel trope to justify the rape of Black and African women. That's the crazy thing about this specific stereotype. It's not a chicken and egg situation. There should be no discussion of what came first or if Black women are inherently sexually deviant. It's literally that white people needed a reason to justify institutional rape, so they blamed it on the victims. Essentially, the hypersexualization of African women's bodies in present-day society can be attributed in large part to the ways in which their bodies have historically been exploited, objectified, eroticized, and othered. And there's a dangerous catch-22 that comes with this. Black/African women have historically silenced their sexuality as a way of securing a chaste image of themselves so as to counteract negative stereotypes and representations of them. This silencing has resulted in the refusal of Black/African women to speak out against sexual abuse as well as sexual exploitation. To this day, women of African descent may choose not to report their abusive partners to authorities for fear that they will further stigmatize Black/African people's experiences. The society we live in says that the only apparent value of Black women is sexuality, and being hypersexualized does not equate to being desirable, especially in a romantic lens. Black women's sexuality was and is considered to be a commodity, something that you can buy and sell in a marketplace. And it's a very unique position and experience that Black women have been relegated to. Nicole Seck writes, Black/African women have been struggling to dispel myths about them being the antithesis of lady or unladylike for centuries. As a matter of fact, along with the emergence of an idealistic femininity in the 18th century, wherein white, middle, and upper class women were perceived as epitomizing morality, social status, and respectability, came the depiction of working class women, both Black and white, as emblematic of dangerous, vulgar, and lacking in sexual discipline. So in the patriarchal society we live in order to be seen as desirable as a woman, you should be feminine. And while femininity at its core is about possessing certain expressive traits like sensitivity and warmth, it has evolved to be racialized and synonymous with white women. Because according to the rules of racism, Blackness detracts from femininity. Femininity has also become a materialistic endeavor because middle and upper class white women were the blueprint for it, and to this day you need money to access things like nice clothes and makeup and subsequently femininity. I feel like Black women have to use femininity as armor to protect against hypersexualization and as a tool to even be seen or considered in certain spaces, like especially professional spaces. And femininity is not always easy to perform. It takes time and it takes money. And growing up, I definitely felt frustrated that the beauty/femininity standard was so high for Black women, and white women kind of seemed like they could get away with doing the bare minimum and still be considered beautiful and desirable. But I do think of this Eurocentric idea of femininity as a spectrum, and I feel like the spectrum of femininity also aligns with like a spectrum of desirability, and I feel like the richer, the whiter, the thinner you are, the higher you are on the spectrum of femininity, at least through like this macro lens that we're looking at. Obviously, just being rich, white, and pretty doesn't make you inherently a good person or inherently desirable, but that's like the value our society places on it, I suppose. And you know, on the opposite end of the spectrum, like the poorer you are, the fatter you are, the blacker you are, I feel like that's society places less desirability and less femininity to those traits. And when I do think of it like this on a spectrum, it really makes sense to see how colorism plays out for Black women and for other women of color. Dark-skinned enslaved women were often viewed in terms of their physicality, but rarely were they thought of as innately feminine or attractive. Thus, to this day, Eurocentric ideals of chastity, delicacy, and femininity have never been labels that Black/African women could adopt freely. As Hooks explains in Black Looks, Race, and Representation, the 18th century marked the beginning of representations of both Black/African men and women as the deviant, sexualized other. It's so rare to see a darker-skinned Black woman in movies and TV shows portrayed as a love interest or desirable unless she or someone who looks like her has literally written that character into the narrative. I feel like Hollywood has reached an inflection point where people are demanding diversity, and it looks really out of touch, at least from my perspective, to have an all-white cast these days. However, otherness and the diversity that comes with it is simply being commodified. And being commodified is not the same thing as being inherently valued like whiteness has been valued for centuries. So when otherness suddenly has some relevant currency, but whiteness is still what is most highly valued and the norm, it's really convenient to cast people who fall into the middle of the Venn diagram of otherness and whiteness. I'd like to give casting directors the benefit of the doubt. I don't think they're casting the same biracial / mixed black women to represent all / monoracial black women out of malice per se. They just know whiteness as the thing that works and is more marketable. Nicole Seck brilliantly describes this commodification of otherness as a spice, a seasoning that can liven up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture. We as Black / African people are taken up as entertainment to a mass of people who discern our bodies as spice, which is sometimes wanted and other times not. And in his essay, To All the Boys I Loved Before has some creepy racial things going on, Chris Jesu Lee describes this phenomenon in the context of the commodification of Asianness. What's paramount is what is marketable. With Asians, what's deemed widely marketable are usually food and women. Therefore, a story like To All the Boys I've Loved Before is proclaimed as a triumph for Asians because it's harvested the bare minimum of the most profitable aspects of Asianness. Never mind that entire swaths of the culture and people have been completely erased. Too bad, their share price in the racial stock exchange isn't high enough. And this harvesting of the bare minimum of the most profitable aspects of insert any form of otherness is the main problem with TV shows and movies that strive for diverse representation today. Lee writes, one could argue that writers should have the freedom to write any character they want and that a character's race doesn't have to be the crux of the storyline. But that doesn't mean race should be a throwaway characteristic. Saying that not every black movie has to be about slavery or the civil rights movement does not mean that black characters should just be a dark-skinned white person. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's it. That's what we need to send to people making TV shows and movies. Okay, got a little off topic with media, but back to black women and desirability. I was reading this book called Dataclysm by Christian Rudder. He's a co-founder of OkCupid, and he dug through some of the data this dating website has collected and created a narrative out of it. Before 2014, OkCupid had a rating system that users used to rate potential dates. The system ranges from 1 to 5 stars, with 5 stars being the most attractive. I've never used this and I don't really know how the matching process works. I've heard that they don't have these rating systems anymore, but rating people used to be a huge part of OkCupid, and Rudder found really interesting information from the data. Rudder found that men tend to like women of their own race. Far more than that, though, they don't like black women. Black women by far had the lowest attractiveness ratings. And even those in the most attractive percentile of black women were on average rated 3/4 of a star lower than everyone else. Theoretically, this set of data represented that the most attractive black woman is as attractive as an average appearing white woman. Of course, this data is a little bit dated and it's only from one website, so it's not like this is scientific fact. I want to emphasize that. But it's also not like the men rating these women were actively racist. In fact, the users of OkCupid tended to be more urban, more progressive, and more educated than the average internet user. But again, this data is based not on science, but on socialization. There is no proof that one race is inherently more attractive or more intelligent than any other, but the institution of white supremacy has supported the baseless notion that Eurocentric beauty is the ideal for centuries. Again, the bias showed in this data doesn't come from thin air. It comes from a historical standard of beauty and femininity that is informed by proximity to whiteness. And it also comes from a stereotype that has justified the dehumanization of black women for centuries. And when people don't acknowledge that history because it's so long ago or because it possibly couldn't affect black women today, it's incredibly harmful, because then the blame falls on black women, and that's what's so insidious about the institution of white supremacy. it's invisible. People think that if there isn't a single racist culprit to point to, then racism isn't there. And if you think like that, then the natural next step is to say, okay, well, clearly black women, you're doing something wrong. And that something wrong is being born with black skin. Nicole Seck writes, Black/African women are led to believe that their bodies are worthless except when related to sex, while white women's bodies are constantly celebrated. In a capitalist society where the all-determining factor is exchange on the market, white women get to simply exist and are still deemed more valuable than black women, who are only valued when attached to sex. That sounds fucking depressing, right? Because it is. And this is not anecdotal evidence. This is what history in staggering numbers has shown us. Even if you are a black woman who has not personally experienced what I'm describing, it's still important to acknowledge that black womanhood and this chasm between value and desirability exists. I've been lucky enough to not have experienced the worst of this violence against black women, but I still think it's imperative that this narrative changes, because words have value and labels are very sticky. In order for this false narrative surrounding black women to change, first and foremost, we must be humanized and valued for existing. For such a long time, black women were only viewed as sexual reproductive tools that produced labor. Essentially, they were a means to an economic end. So for a long time, black women haven't had the ability to be loved or desired for being who they are. And desirability can lead to relationships, which can lead to marriage, which is quite frankly an economic tool and a means of survival in the world we live in. And the West does have this ideal of quixotic romantic marriages, but at the end of the day, under capitalism, marriage and finding a desirable partner is based on a mutually beneficial exchange. And our society even rewards people for being married. On an individual level, of course, I think anyone should be able to do whatever they want to do with their life. You don't need marriage to be fulfilled or be happy. But on a macro level, there are clearly social and economic benefits that come to those who are married. And the problem is that black women have a lesser chance of accessing those benefits for no reason. Like, there's no reason why it should be that way. It's just racism. The desirability of black women is also unique in America because while other groups of women of color have been fetishized, no other group that I really know of has been as brutalized and as masculized as black women have been. Racial fetishization at its worst is violent, harmful, and dehumanizing, but at its best, it simply signals desirability. Most people of color hate when white people say,
I don't see color.
Because
if you don't see my blackness, you don't see me.
So I'm not saying that black women should be fetishized in order to be seen, but someone desiring you and valuing you on an individual level because of your race is not an inherently bad thing, especially if you've been historically devalued and dehumanized because of your race. It's not a bad place to start. It's why we have slogans like Black Girl Magic. It gives black women the benefit of the doubt and assumes that we're all magical and amazing. And that's kind of what you need to hear when you've been told the exact opposite of that for centuries. Sometimes it is hard to process and to talk about this institutional racism and oppression because it seems so insurmountable. I am an optimistic person, and of course I think it's so important to know history and how we got here and acknowledge it. But I also think, like, for my own survival and for my own sanity, it's just important to focus on what I can control. I can't control what the statistics say or take back the harm that these stereotypes have inflicted, but I can speak to myself positively and remind myself that I am valuable for existing and for being black. I can hype up other black women, not only for their achievements, but just for being. But I'm also a writer and a filmmaker, and I can create art that changes the narrative. And this brings me back to media representation. It's not necessarily a cure-all, nor will it end racism, but it was used to perpetuate racist stereotypes, so I think it can be used to reverse them as well. As we have seen, any persistent message can't trump science and reason, and the message that Black women deserve to be valued for who we are is not in disagreement with either of those things. So in theory, this is a very easy message to spread, and it can be done in many different ways. Of course, we have started to make progress, especially in the 90s and early 2000s with the representation of Black women on screen. Unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with a lot of those because I was not a functioning human being at the time. But even as of late, I think progress is happening again. Obviously, we still have a long way to go, but this is all to say, someone please hire me to write a rom-com about a young Black woman. Okay, that is all for this video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Leave your thoughts below. I always love hearing what you guys have to say, and I hope you have a wonderful Valentine's Day. Yeah, you are loved and you are valued. Remember that. And I'll see you next time. Bye.